Alright, last time we did one of these, we talked about Kyogre, literally one of the strongest and greatest Pokemon ever. Arguably, the most consistently excellent water creature in the series. So let's change course again, like we did with Flareon. Let's talk about Machamp. And yeah, I know Machamp is actually good. Even with power creep, it's very respectable. But I've been looking at these Pokemon in this series based on their entire history, and especially on their debut generation, which is what I did for Kyogre, despite the fact that it's still relevant many years later. And Machamp, being a Gen 1 Pokemon, kinda used to suck. That seems insane with its really good stats that only got better with the special stat split. But, well, Gen 1 has a way of making a good thing not so good. So let's talk about it. But first, if you guys like lo-fi, Luna's World might be the place for you. I will leave that in the description below. So if you're not familiar with Gen 1 Machamp, you definitely might be surprised to hear that it sucks in red, blue, and yellow. If you're judging by something like Smogon Tears, it goes from PU in Gen 1 to OU in Gen 2. No. Being a lower tier on the Smogon format doesn't mean you're actually a bad Pokemon in every aspect, as Nidoking is NU in red, blue, and yellow, and we all know it's a very good mon in single player runs. But Machamp? Well, it's genuinely subpar in this game. Tiers be damned either way. So what happened? Why is it bad when the stats are so solid by Gen 1 standards? First, let's take a look at those stats again. A bit lacking next to the crazy power creep of today, but pretty good for Gen 1. These stats only get better in Gen 2, where it gets 20 more points in special defense thanks to the split, making its defenses pretty average amongst its peers in these earlier generations. But in Gen 1, none of this seems to matter for it. Red and Blue Machamp was never great. A big part of this is the typing. Fighting types just ain't it in Gen 1. Even in Gen 2, it feels like their stab options are lacking, but it's definitely worse in red, blue, and yellow. Submission is basically your best stab unless you're Hitmonlee, and the recoil damage is not fun. Not to mention 80% accuracy for a move with that much recoil, and it's only 80 power? At least in Stadium 1, there's no recoil if it causes the opponent to faint, but that's Stadium only. There's also low kick, but it's not based on weight yet, and won't be until Gen 3. So it's pretty much just 50 power, but it has a 30% flinch chance, which is pretty awesome. But also 90% for an attack with such mediocre power, it's not as awesome as it could be. To add onto the issue of fighting type woes, it happens to be weak to one of the top 2 typings in Gen 1, Psychic. And with its special stat being 20 points lower in Gen 1, it's even more worse off. And those Psychic types remain scary for a couple of generations after this. So those extra 20 points it gets after Red, Blue, and Yellow don't help too much against the best of the best Psychics. Its 90 base HP is pretty decent this early on, but it's not enough to save it in most games either from those tough special attacks. There's a reason Alakazam strikes more fear into your heart in Gen 1 than Machamp does. Lastly, and this has less to do with its quality, but we have to mention the way it evolves. You gotta trade your Machoke with another player, and then it'll evolve on their end. Then you gotta trade it back if you want your Machamp. Today, it's easy enough to coordinate online. Back then, not as simple, unless you have 2 Game Boys and 2 Gen 1 Pokemon games. Definitely a lot easier if you had a sibling or something. Otherwise though, it could be tough to find someone to trade with, because you or that person would also need to have a link cable to trade with at that moment too. It all depended on how much your circle of friends were into the Pokemon craze. Today, if you're using the actual cartridges, you probably also have a Game Boy Advance. So maybe it's not too bad for some of you to authentically trade your Gen 1 Pokemon around for this stuff in 2024 if you're serious about it. But still, it's not convenient. It never was. So with that trade requirement, Gen 1 Machamp was never quite as worth the trouble as Alakazam, Golem, or Gengar were. You'd still need it to complete the Pokédex. And if you are a Machamp superfan, well, it's not that bad. Just not as nearly as good as it should be. What about its previous forms? Well, Machamp is a pretty decent early mod. Low kick is still good enough at level 20 as a stab move. An 80 base attack and 70 base health is really good for a first form. Machoke is also fine, but I feel like its evolution takes a tad long getting it to level 28. It does have a cool design though, but it definitely falls behind other Pokemon real quick if it's not evolved at some point in its 30s range, even more so being a Gen 1 fighting type. There's also Machamp's really bad move pool in Gen 1. The only other good physical attacks I can think of that it learns that are normal type are Rock Slide and Earthquake. Earthquake is an incredible move, but do you really think of Earthquake when you think of coverage for Machamp? It's more reliable than Submission for sure, since it has actual accuracy. But who's giving their Earthquake TM to Machamp? Not to mention for raw damage, if you want big ground damage on an easy to get early ground type, just give it to Sandslash or something. If you're more patient or ambitious, then of course there's Pokemon like Rhydon, though that almost seems like overkill. Now, I have been kind of negative, like the Flareon video if you remember that one. But unlike Flareon, Machamp immediately improved in the next game. GSC Machamp has access to Cross Chop. At first glance, it doesn't seem much better than Submission with that 80% accuracy. However, the 100 power, high crit ratio, and lack of recoil damage is pretty good. It's not totally reliable, but getting hit by it is so risky and so brutal. Just having Curse and Cross Chop alone makes this thing go from a bland third form to a total Chad in Gen 2. In Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, the addition of abilities was awesome for it. Guts was pretty amazing, and new items like Choice Band fit right in with it. And Gen 4? No Guard and Dynamic Punch were horrifying. Possibly the best this thing ever was. A total freaking monster. But you guys probably already knew about how good it was there, especially if you are a Machamp fan. It was actually how uniquely mediocre it was in Red, Blue, and Yellow that inspired me to choose Machamp to talk about this time around, since it's not really talked about too much. And I think it's a good example of a zero to hero situation with how good it got so fast. Sure, power creep does catch up as we go through this series, but it always remained pretty respectable after Gen 1. Which thankfully allowed it to keep its status as one of the most iconic vintage fighting types. Anyway, I think that's a good place to end this for Machamp. I could have talked about its anime appearances and stuff, but it's not exactly known for winning in the anime, and I was critical enough about it in Red and Blue. But what about you guys? Any Machamp fans in the chat? Has it won you any Pokemon Showdown matches in the Gen 2 or 4 meta? Or maybe something newer? Or maybe stuff I'm not as familiar with anymore, like Pokken Tournament? Let me know down below, and also let me know what Pokemon you guys want to see me do next if you guys want to see me ramble about that.